Debate obviously teaches things, but how do we model it to make sure it's teaching the best way it can? I'm going to propose a rhetorical model of debate, which is a return to what debate is meant to teach, which is the art of rhetoric, the art of oratory, the art of making arguments and listening to arguments and engaging with other people's ideas as a very humanistic practice and a very oral practice. But in order to get to that point and make that argument, I need to review a little bit of how we got to where we are now. In the United States, debate is primarily considered a game, and not much more than that. It's a competitive game played by students for each other for some kind of democratic, social, educational benefit. We're not sure. There's not a lot of data that communicates that people learn very much at all from being a part of their competitive debate program. There is a general feeling that it's good, and people tend to like it, and that comes from, I think, the aesthetic and affective power of speech and power of rhetoric itself. But the way debate is designed goes all the way back to the foundation of the American communication discipline. James Milton O'Neill, who's a professor at the University of Wisconsin, I have one of his books right here that he wrote with his co-author, McBurney here. This book was a very popular textbook, and in this book that James O'Neill wrote, this is much later than the arguments I'm talking about. This was like 1930s, but it's a reprint from 1920s. O'Neill is the founder of the speech communication discipline. He argued for years that we need to have professional professors of speech and public speaking because it's so important to democratic society and order. The way that we teach that is through debate. So debate has to be modeled in a way, and he said that debate is a game. It's a game that we evaluate and we say who won and who lost, and through that, people learn. Now, he had it that they were learning how to speak and how to interact in democratic forums. They weren't after the facts or the truth or the right answer, but what was persuasive to groups at the time, and that's how he modeled the game. He had interlocutors debate him for years. In fact, for 2 full years, the Quarterly Journal of Public Speaking, which O'Neill edited, almost every essay is about, is debate a game or not? So we can assume he won in the realm of competitive debate, which is all over the country. And there's something valuable about the amount of private and public money that goes into teaching young people something through making them debate a lot. I think there's a lot there. But the model of it is limiting the power of debate to be the engine of teaching rhetoric. We need rhetoric right now. Rhetoric is the thing that glues and holds democratic societies together. It gives us the practice and the practices and the attitude to where we can talk to people who we think are fundamentally wrong, and we think of it not a question of who they are as people, as subjects, as beings, but the attitudes and the discourse that they present is what needs adjustment. Right now in our political situation, almost globally, everybody seems to think the problem is other people are stupid. But in a rhetorical perspective, it's that other people have the wrong attitude about the motives that are going on. If I can change the motives and change their perspective of the motives of what's happening, I can alter their attitude. They're fine who they are. They're wonderful human beings. It's not a question of existence. It's a question of discourse and expression. And rhetoric brings us back to that level instead of saying people are fundamentally wrong in their complete identity. So how did we go astray? How did things get off of the O'Neill chart? Well, we turned almost everything over to sportified competitive debate, where debate coaches and instructors are happy to have wins, and they think that learning is just kind of happening based on their students being successful and winning and things like that. There's not a lot of research on that, but it would be nice if we had that research, but we don't. The big change came in the 60s. With Integer and Brockry's book, Decision by Debate. Here's a copy of it right here. This is a reprint too. I really need more original text if I'm going to study this thing, I think. Decision by Debate says that the purpose of debate and why debate matters is it teaches people critical acumen for good decision making. Now, that's a huge shift too. Now we're no longer in the realm of democratic deliberation. I guess we could be if the decision is one that we're making on voting or public policy or something like that. But to reduce debate down to the tool that helps make good decisions is really reductive. And it eliminates that past history of making people good operators, holistic operators in a democratic society, able to engage and listen and come up with all kinds of great thoughts and interact to where the greater good happens. The Integer and Brockry approach is that debate narrows down your choices to the most reasonable ones, and then we hash it out between which one is best based on facts and information. And this model of debate is just bad. It eliminates all creativity, all of the productive art from it, all of the history and tradition of rhetoric. Contrast that model of debate from a Roman one, where the Romans would teach their students how to use the values and the principles of society, the stories and the things that society loves and cherishes, to make arguments intelligible where they were not intelligible before. Intelligibility is the number one principle of a rhetorical model of debate. Debate is that practice which allows us to say, this argument is not necessarily bad or good, it's either intelligible or unintelligible for different audiences. Let me make a meta comparison here. Penelope Reed Dube's great book, The Idea of the Labyrinth, was written in 1990, talks about that there are two primary ways of viewing mazes. There's one that's multi-cursoral, which means there are many, many different paths, and a lot of those paths are meant to deceive you and trick you. And then there's unicursal, where there is a path that's long and you turn and you make decisions, but in the end, through that journey of making those decisions, you're still going to wind up at a center place to reflect on your journey, and then you're going to come back out again. It's not about tricking you or making you make decisions or anything like that. It's about the journey and the path. I think debate should be more like the unicursoral maze. The multicursoral maze is where we are now in our models of debate, which is it's a game to teach people how to decide which is the right way to turn to get out. It's problem solution. That is flat, that is uninspired, that is not creative. That's the decision by debate model of debating. What if we had a model of debate where the journey itself was meant to be studied? I think one of the most important things that we could teach is from Chaim Perlman and Lucy Ulbricht-Tedesca's book, The New Rhetoric. This book has in it lots of different concepts, but one that I think is most important is the universal audience. When students go through the maze of debate, they're thinking about getting out of the maze, and then they're done. There's no reflection on the maze. There's no reflection on the turns. Once a choice is made, or once a false door has been determined from a real door, and a lot of people teach debate like this as a way of determining real facts from fake facts, or fake news from real news, or bad information and good information. For example, the way the fallacies are most commonly taught is this, oh, you discovered how the trick works, you're good. But those doors and those passageways are not going to look the same outside of the maze as they do in the real world. When we go out there, it's not going to be the same. Instead, that journey should be one that's curated by the Labyrinth designer and then reaches a place of contemplation. And that is, were those turns and choices in my journey through this debate intelligible to this audience? How would those turns and choices have changed if the audience changes? And that way the maze can be walked again and again. Since it's unicursal, you're always going to end up at that center place. It's not going to be that there's just one correct answer or one way through the maze and you manage to avoid all the pitfalls and the traps of that labyrinth. So Dube's work is really good on this, and the unicursal maze is the primary model of maze that we find in human history. The multicursoral maze is not as common, but is mostly used as a prison or a trap, something to keep people confused and occupied and inside of it. Instead of a labyrinth or a maze being something that traps people who can't critically reason, or it's like an escape room, it tries to trick you and see who's really smart or not. That model of debate, even though that's the primary model globally, or at least in the United States, I think it's the primary model, but you see this in Karl Popper, you see this in British parliamentary as a place that the smart people can figure it out kind of game. The unicursal maze is a game of, why did I turn this way instead of that way this time? Who am I who makes these turns? And if we broaden that to the universal audience, it's this idea of, which audience am I speaking to? Am I just going to pander to the audience right in front of me? Or am I going to speak to an audience that exemplifies those best ways of thinking and listening and reasoning that I want out of my audience? The universal audience is a model that says to us, make sure you're speaking to the audience you would want to have while keeping in mind the audience that you do have. Instead of just adapting for them or for the expert audience who says that this is the right argument for this case, or this is the only thing you can say in this case, think about it in terms of, we want to model and perform the kind of arguments that good thinkers and reasonable members of our society that we'd want to share society with would think this way. So the rhetor becomes a kind of a teacher every time they speak in the universal audience model. As a final parting thought, what was at the center of these unicursoral mazes for the designers of labyrinths in medieval times? Often it was a garden, and a garden is a place where we practice growth. We weed, we cultivate, we prefer certain plants over others. We train them to grow on vines, on trellises, and things like that. And I think that's the way to think about what debate should teach. A rhetorical model of debate forwards rhetoric as a place where we practice growing. We practice the development and the growth and the expansion of ideas, not a reductive tool to choose between extant ideas generated by other fields. That's the decision by debate model. That's the thing, and if any debate scholar tells you that debate is meant to help you make better decisions, they are not right. They are limiting debate in its epistemic power to something very reductive. Instead, think of it like the garden, the place where we can choose to try to grow different kinds of plants together and see how they do. The growth, the idea combination comes from trying to write for different kinds of audiences while keeping in mind the model of the universal audience, the people who we'd want to share society with. People can be taught to think differently. People can be educated to think differently. It's up to the rhetor and up to us, and debate is the place to practice those rhetorical moves and those rhetorical theories. The unicursal maze, the rhetorical model of debate, is something that stands, I think, quite in contrast to models of debate that are, here's the problem, find the way to solve it, or to teach students how to recognize traps in a game that somehow is going to translate to them being good operators in a democratic system. Instead of that, let's have more reflection and more creativity and more idea of like, what are the motives and what are the ideas? What's this person's garden that they have grown? How can I help weed it? How can I help trim it back? How can I help train those plants to grow in a way that's better for society? And that's what the rhetorical model of debate is all about. The specifics of it, I don't know, matter that much. But I think the most important thing is that we change it from, instead of did they make the right argument, did they use the right information, to did they make their claim intelligible for an audience of people who I would want to have as my neighbors, as fellow voters, as fellow political actors in my society.